When his grandfather died, he thought he'd lost everything. What he discovered on a forgotten ranch would force him to fight for more than just land. If you've ever felt like your story was written by someone else, hit that subscribe button, because we're going to talk about taking back the pen. The day I turned 18 was the day I legally ceased to exist, at least as far as the state was concerned. For 2 years, since the social worker had cleared out my dad's apartment, I had been a case file, a ward, a line item in a budget. Now, I was just Leo. And Leo was nobody, with nothing, standing on the cracked linoleum of the Pine Creek group home entryway, holding a single cardboard box that contained every object I owned in the world. The air smelled of bleach and boiled potatoes, the official perfume of institutional life. It was a smell I wouldn't miss. Mr. Henderson, the house manager, gave my shoulder a firm, awkward squeeze. His hand felt like a bundle of dry twigs. "Well, son," he said, his voice trying for warmth, but landing somewhere near weary. "The world's your oyster now." I didn't have the heart to tell him I was allergic to shellfish. The world felt less like an oyster and more like a locked door without a key. My box held 2 pairs of jeans, a few faded t-shirts, a worn copy of a book my mom used to read to me, and a small, framed photo of her and my dad, smiling on a beach I couldn't remember. That was it, the sum total of my inheritance. I had a bus ticket to the city, $150 in cash from a state-sponsored emancipation fund, and the phone number of a youth shelter that was probably already full. My plan, such as it was, involved finding a dishwashing job and a room somewhere cheap enough that the cockroaches paid rent. It wasn't a dream, but it was a direction. I was halfway to the door, the finality of it a cold weight in my stomach, when Henderson cleared his throat again. "Oh, almost forgot. This came for you. Special delivery." He handed me a thick, cream-colored envelope. It felt heavy, important. My name and the group home's address were typed on the front. In the top left corner, the return address read, Abernathy and Finch, Attorneys at Law, Big Timber, Montana. Montana. The word itself felt foreign, like a place from an old movie. I didn't know anyone in Montana. I didn't know any lawyers. "Probably junk mail," I said, trying to sound casual, but my fingers were already tracing the embossed lettering. "Doesn't feel like junk mail," Henderson said, his curiosity piqued. He lingered, waiting for me to open it. The pressure of his gaze felt like a physical thing. I wanted to be alone when I opened it, to process whatever it was, a bill, a mistake, a final, cruel joke, without an audience. I tucked the envelope into my jacket pocket. "Thanks, Mr. Henderson, for everything." The lie was thin, but it was the polite thing to do. He nodded, satisfied that his duty was done, and retreated back into the stale air of the home. I stepped outside, and for the first time in 2 years, there was no one to tell me where to go or when to be back. The freedom was dizzying, terrifying. The sun was bright, making me squint. I walked to the bus stop at the end of the block, my box digging into my hip. I sat on the hard plastic bench and pulled out the envelope. My hands were shaking a little. With a deep breath, I tore it open. Inside was a letter, printed on the same heavy paper. The language was dense, full of words like testament, beneficiary, and probate. I had to read each sentence 2 or 3 times for it to sink in. It was from a man named Arthur Abernathy, a lawyer. He was the executor of the estate of my late grandfather, Thomas Vance. My grandfather. I hadn't seen him since I was 6 years old, a year before my parents died in the car accident that had sent my life spiraling into the system. My father and he had a falling out. a chasm of anger and pride that was never bridged. My dad always said his father was a hard man, that he cared more for his land than his own blood. After the accident, we'd heard nothing. No call, no card, no visit, just silence. We assumed he wanted nothing to do with us, the orphaned remnants of his estranged son. I'd spent 12 years believing he had washed his hands of me completely. According to the letter, Thomas Vance had passed away 3 months ago, and he had left me something. A 1/3 interest in the Vance family ranch, Black Creek Ranch, Big Timber, Montana. A place I only knew from a single faded photograph in my dad's old wallet. The letter went on to say that my cousins, Mark and Sarah Vance, held the other 2/3 interest and were eager to liquidate the asset. It requested my presence for a final reading of the will and to discuss a significant and time-sensitive offer from a development corporation. My head was swimming. A ranch. I owned part of a ranch. The idea was so absurd, so completely outside the realm of my reality, that I almost laughed. What was I supposed to do with a piece of a ranch in Montana? I was a kid who knew how to navigate bus schedules and avoid fights in the common room, not how to ranch. The letter concluded by stating that a bus ticket had been arranged for me and would be waiting at the city terminal. It was for a bus leaving the next day. Everything was moving too fast. My plan, the dishwashing job, the cheap room, was already dissolving. I found a payphone and dialed the number at the bottom of the letter. A calm, professional voice answered. Abernathy and Finch. I asked for Arthur Abernathy, and after a brief hold, a man with a low, gravelly voice came on the line. This is Arthur. Hi, my name is Leo Vance. I got your letter, I stammered, the words feeling clumsy in my mouth. There was a pause on the other end, and then the voice softened. Leo, I'm glad you called. I was hoping you would. Is this real? It was the only question I could think to ask. It is, he confirmed. Your grandfather was a complicated man, but he was very clear about this. You, Mark, and Sarah are his legal heirs. The ranch is to be divided among you. He explained the situation again, more simply this time. My cousins, the children of my father's older brother, lived nearby and had managed the property in my grandfather's final years. They had already received a multi-million-dollar offer from a company called Mountain Ridge Estates. They wanted to build a luxury resort community. All they needed was my signature. They're pushing for a quick sale, son, Abernathy said, a note of caution in his voice. The offer is substantial. It would be life-changing money for you. Life-changing. He had no idea. The $150 in my pocket felt like a joke. Why did he leave it to me? I asked, the question raw. I thought he hated my dad. I thought he hated me. Abernathy was quiet for a moment. Like I said, he was a complicated man. He never spoke much about his feelings, but his will is clear. He wanted you to have a share. Perhaps he wanted you to see the place for yourself before you made any decisions. See the place. The idea took root in my mind. A place that was, in some small way, mine. A place that connected me to a family I barely knew, to a past that was a complete blank. Maybe there were answers there. Maybe there was something more than just a payout. I'll be there, I said, the decision solidifying as I spoke the words. I'll take the bus tomorrow. Good, Abernathy said, and I could hear the genuine relief in his tone. I'll meet you at the station in Big Timber. We'll go out to the ranch together. Your cousins are expecting us. He gave me his cell number and told me to call if I had any trouble. I hung up the phone, my mind a whirlwind. The world Henderson had just shoved me into no longer looked like a locked door. It looked like a long, dusty road leading west toward a place I'd never been, a family I didn't know, and a choice that would define whatever came next. I looked at the box at my feet, the sum of my entire life. It suddenly felt very, very small. The bus ride was a 3-day marathon of stale air, rumbling engines, and the endless, hypnotic scroll of the American landscape. I watched cities bleed into suburbs, suburbs into farmland, and farmland into the vast, empty plains of the Dakotas. For the first day, I was numb, my mind still processing the tectonic shift in my reality. I kept rereading the lawyer's letter until the creases were soft as cloth. I was no longer Leo, the ward of the state. I was Leo Vance, part owner of a ranch. The name felt like an ill-fitting coat, something I was trying on for the first time. As the bus pushed further west, the skies seemed to get bigger, the land flatter and more immense than anything I had ever seen. It was beautiful and intimidating. I spent hours staring out the window, lost in thought. I tried to conjure a memory of my grandfather, to put a face to the name on the will. All I could recall was a tall, stern figure from a family gathering when I was very young. He had huge, calloused hands and a voice that sounded like rocks grinding together. He hadn't smiled. He'd given me a wooden toy horse he'd carved himself. I'd lost it somewhere along the way, another casualty of the chaos that followed my parents' death. My father rarely spoke of him, and when he did, his voice was tight with a specific kind of pain, the kind reserved for family. He chose the dirt over his own son, Dad had said once, late at night, after a few beers. That land is his wife, his child, his God. There was never any room for us. That was the story I had carried with me, the story of a cold man who loved a piece of land more than his own family. A man who had abandoned his son, and then, by extension, his grandson. And yet here I was, on a bus paid for by that same man, heading toward that same land. It didn't make sense. Why, after all these years of silence, would he include me in his will? Why give me a stake in the one thing that had supposedly torn his family apart? I thought about the money. A third of a multi-million-dollar deal. The numbers were so large, they were abstract. It was enough to go to college, to buy a car, to get an apartment in a building where I wouldn't have to worry about the heat being shut off. It was a ticket to a different life, a life of stability and security I couldn't even properly imagine. It was everything I was supposed to want. The smart thing to do, the logical thing, was to show up, sign the papers, take the check, and disappear. It would be a clean break. But a small, stubborn part of me, a part that sounded a little like my mom, whispered that the easy path wasn't always the right one. She had always believed in facing things head-on, in understanding the truth before making a choice. "You can't run from your own story, Leo," she used to say. "You have to stand still and read it." Maybe this was my chance to do that, to read the part of my story that had been a blank page for 12 years. As we crossed into Montana, the landscape began to change again. The flat plains gave way to rolling hills, and in the distance, I saw the jagged, snow-capped peaks of mountains. They looked like teeth on the edge of the world. The sheer scale of it all made me feel tiny, insignificant. The bus smelled of diesel fumes and cheap coffee. The man next to me snored with a wet, rattling sound. I hadn't slept much. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the ranch from that one faded photo. A long, low-slung house with a porch, a massive red barn behind it, and endless green fields stretching to a line of dark pine trees. In the photo, a man who must have been my grandfather stood on the porch, a silhouette against the setting sun. I wondered if he ever thought of me, if he ever regretted the silence. I wondered if the ranch was as beautiful as I imagined. The bus finally pulled into Big Timber, a small town nestled in a river valley. It was late afternoon, and the sun cast long shadows across the main street. The air was crisp and clean, smelling of pine and something else, something wild and earthy. It was a world away from the smog and concrete I was used to. I stepped off the bus, my legs stiff, clutching my cardboard box. The station was little more than a small office and a gravel lot. Standing by a dusty but well-maintained pickup truck was a man who had to be Arthur Abernathy. He was in his late 60s, with a kind face, a shock of white hair, and a frame that was still sturdy. He wore a tweed jacket over a denim shirt, a strange mix of professional and country. He smiled when he saw me, a genuine, welcoming smile that immediately put me at ease. "Leo?" he asked, his voice exactly as it had sounded on the phone. I nodded. "Mr. Abernathy." "Call me Arthur," he said, shaking my hand. His grip was firm and dry. "Long trip?" "You could say that." He took my box. "Let's get this in the truck. It's about a 40-minute drive out to the ranch. Your cousins are already there. They're anxious to get this settled." The way he said anxious made it sound like a diagnosis. We climbed into the truck, and he navigated us out of town and onto a 2-lane highway that followed the curves of a rushing river. The scenery was breathtaking. Mountains rose up on either side of us, their peaks touching the clouds. "Your grandfather loved this valley," Arthur said, noticing my awe. "Said it was the last piece of heaven on earth." "Did you know him well?" I asked. "I did. I was his lawyer for 30 years, his friend for longer. He wasn't an easy man to know, Leo. He kept his own counsel, but he was a good man, a man of his word." This didn't square with the image I had of him. "He never contacted me," I said, the old hurt surfacing. "Not once, not after my parents died." Arthur kept his eyes on the road. "Thomas had his reasons for things. They weren't always reasons other people could understand, but they were his. I think he wanted you to see this place, to understand what it is, what he was, before you decided its fate." He turned off the highway onto a gravel road marked by a simple wooden sign that read, "Black Creek Ranch." We drove for another 10 minutes, the truck kicking up a plume of dust behind us. The road was lined with old-growth cottonwoods, their leaves just beginning to turn yellow. And then we rounded a bend, and I saw it, the ranch. It was exactly like the photograph, and yet so much more. The house was a long, white clapboard building with a deep porch, its paint peeling in places. The red barn behind it was enormous, its roof slightly sagging in the middle. There were fences that needed mending, and fields that were overgrown with weeds, but it was all there. It was real. A wave of emotion, something too complex to name, washed over me. It felt like coming home to a place I'd never been. Parked in front of the house was a shiny new SUV that looked completely out of place. As we pulled up, 2 people emerged from the house and stood on the porch, their arms crossed. My cousins. They looked nothing like me, and their expressions were anything but welcoming. The fight, I realized, was just beginning. Mark and Sarah stood on the porch like a pair of sentinels guarding a fortress they couldn't wait to abandon. Mark was my age but looked older, with a premature hardness around his eyes and a stocky build that strained the seams of his polo shirt. Sarah was a few years older, sharp and severe, with her blonde hair pulled back in a tight ponytail. They both had the same thin, impatient mouth. "You must be Leo," Sarah said, her voice flat, devoid of any warmth. It wasn't a question. "Took you long enough." "Bus was on time," I said, my own voice coming out quieter than I intended. I felt small under their collective gaze. "This is Arthur Abernathy," I added, gesturing to the lawyer beside me. "We know who he is," Mark grunted, not bothering to make eye contact with Arthur. He was looking past me at the land, as if mentally calculating its value per square foot. The hostility was so thick I could taste it. Arthur, to his credit, was unfazed. "Mark, Sarah, good to see you both." He set my box down on the porch steps. "Leo's had a long journey. I think we should all go inside and sit down." We entered the house, and I was hit by the smell of dust, old wood, and something else, a faint, lingering scent of pipe tobacco. It was the smell of a place that had been lived in for a very long time by one person. The furniture was old and heavy, dark wood and worn leather. A thick layer of dust covered everything. It was clear no one had been taking care of the interior. In the center of the living room, a massive stone fireplace stood cold and empty. Faded photographs lined the mantelpiece. I saw pictures of my grandparents when they were young, of my uncle, Mark and Sarah's father, as a boy, and even one of my own dad, looking impossibly young and happy, holding a fishing rod. There were no pictures of my mother, and none of me. It was a curated history, with conspicuous gaps. "The offer from Mountain Ridge is on the table," Sarah said, cutting straight to the point. She tapped a thick folder on the coffee table. "It's for $3.2 million. It's more than fair. It's generous, considering the state of the place." "It expires in 72 hours, Mark added, his tone a clear threat. "They want to break ground before the first big snow. We sign, we get the money, we all walk away happy." They had it all planned out. My role was simple: show up, sign, and disappear. I was just a rubber stamp, the final piece of paperwork they needed to cash in. I looked at Arthur. He gave me a subtle, almost imperceptible shake of his head. "Not yet." "I'd like to look around first," I said, the words surprising even myself. "I've never been here." Sarah sighed, a dramatic put-upon sound. "There's nothing to see. It's a broken-down old ranch. Granddad let it go to seed years ago. It's a money pit." "Just for a few minutes," I insisted. I felt a strange pull to explore this place, to walk the floors my father had walked, to see the rooms where my family's story had unfolded and then fractured. Mark shrugged. "Fine, whatever. Take an hour. We'll be waiting. But don't take too long. That money has a deadline." He and Sarah retreated to the kitchen, their voices a low, urgent murmur. I could feel their impatience radiating through the walls. Arthur gave me a nod of encouragement. "Go on, son. Take your time." I started in the living room, running my hand over the dusty mantel. I picked up the photo of my dad. He couldn't have been more than 16, grinning, holding up a trout. He looked free, happy. It was a version of him I had never known. I walked down a short hallway, peering into rooms. The first was my grandfather's bedroom. The bed was neatly made, a simple quilt pulled up tight. On the nightstand sat a pair of reading glasses and a well-worn Bible. It was Spartan, the room of a man who needed little. The next room was a guest room, but the one after that, it was different. It was smaller, and the furniture was clearly for a child. A small wooden desk was tucked under the window, its surface covered in faint scratches and what looked like old crayon marks. A bookshelf held a collection of adventure novels. This must have been my dad's room. I stepped inside, and the air felt different, charged with a faint echo of the past. I ran my hand along the desk, imagining him sitting there, looking out at the same fields I could see now. It was here, in this room, that the first seed of doubt about the story I'd been told was planted. Would a man who hated his son preserve his childhood room like a shrine for 40 years? It didn't add up. I left the house and walked toward the barn. The big red doors groaned in protest as I pushed them open. The inside was cavernous, smelling of hay and earth and time. Light streamed in through dusty gaps in the walls, illuminating dancing dust motes. Old machinery sat silent, draped in cobwebs. Stalls stood empty. It was a place of work, of life, that had fallen quiet. In the corner of the barn was a small, cluttered office. A simple wooden desk was pushed against one wall, and above it, shelves sagged under the weight of binders and ledgers. It was a mess of papers, invoices, and yellowed receipts. But one book stood out. It was a thick, leather-bound volume sitting right in the middle of the desk, as if it had been recently used. It was a grain ledger, the kind farmers use to track their harvests. Its cover was worn smooth from years of handling. I felt an inexplicable urge to pick it up. It felt solid, heavy in my hands. I opened it. The pages were filled with my grandfather's handwriting, a strong, neat script that detailed yields, prices, and weather conditions year after year. It was a meticulous record of the ranch's lifeblood. It was a history of the land, written in numbers and notes. I flipped through the pages, a half-century of work and worry recorded in blue ink. I didn't know what I was looking for. I just felt that this book was important. It felt like the heart of the place, the physical manifestation of my grandfather's devotion to his dirt. I carried it with me as I walked back to the house. The sun was getting lower, painting the mountains in hues of orange and purple. The beauty of the place was overwhelming, a stark contrast to the ugliness waiting for me inside. Mark and Sarah were on the porch again, looking at their watches. "Find what you were looking for?" Mark asked, his voice laced with sarcasm. "I'm not sure," I said, clutching the heavy ledger. We went back inside. The tension in the room had ratcheted up. Sarah had the contract folder open, a pen placed strategically on top. "All right, Leo," she said, her voice taking on a tone of forced pleasantness. "We've all had our little trip down memory lane. It's time to be practical. This is a life-changing opportunity for all of us, especially for you." She pushed the documents across the table. "Just sign here and here." My eyes scanned the top page. Purchase and sale agreement. $3.2 million. My share would be over $1 million. Before taxes anyway. Enough to erase my past and build any future I wanted. My hand trembled as I reached for the pen. This was it. The smart move. The easy way out. I could feel my grandfather's ghost, the cold, distant man my father had described, telling me to take the money and run, that I didn't belong here. But then I looked at the grain ledger sitting on my lap. The weight of it, the history in it. I looked at Arthur, and his expression was calm, steady, waiting. He wasn't pushing me one way or the other. He was simply present. "Before I sign anything," I heard myself say, my voice shaking slightly, "I have a question." All eyes turned to me. "Mr. Abernathy, my grandfather, was he a methodical man?" Arthur smiled faintly. The most methodical man I ever knew. He had a place for everything, and everything was in its place. He kept records of everything, down to the last penny, the last bushel of wheat. Then why, I asked, my voice growing stronger, is the last entry in his grain ledger from 5 years ago? I opened the book on the coffee table. He passed away 3 months ago. A man like that, he wouldn't just stop. Not unless he was physically unable. And you said he was sharp until the end. A flicker of something, annoyance, fear, crossed Mark's face. Sarah's expression tightened. Arthur leaned forward, his eyes fixed on the ledger. You're right, Leo. He wouldn't. He picked up the heavy book and began to carefully turn the pages, starting from the last entry and moving toward the back. He wasn't just flipping them. He was feeling them, testing their thickness, his experienced fingers searching for an inconsistency. About halfway through the blank section, he stopped. Ah, he said softly. There it is. He worked his thumbnail carefully between 2 pages that were stuck together. They had been sealed with a thin, almost invisible line of glue along the edge. With painstaking care, he separated them. The pages fell open to reveal a hollowed-out compartment carved into the thick paper of the ledger, and nestled inside that compartment was a slim, sealed envelope made of the same cream-colored paper as the letter he had sent me. A name was written on the front in my grandfather's strong script. Leo. The silence in the room was absolute, broken only by the sound of the wind whistling around the corners of the old house. Mark and Sarah stared at the envelope as if it were a snake. Sarah was the first to find her voice, and it was sharp as broken glass. What is that? What the hell is that? It appears to be a letter, Arthur said calmly, his gaze fixed on me. Addressed to Leo. He didn't touch it. He slid the open ledger across the coffee table toward me. It was my move. My hands felt clumsy, disconnected from my body, as I reached into the hollowed-out space and lifted the envelope. It was surprisingly heavy. My name, Leo, was written on it, nothing more. I could feel my cousin's eyes burning into me. This is ridiculous, Mark sputtered, getting to his feet. Some kind of joke. The will was clear. We all get a third. We sell, we split the money. That's the deal. The will that was filed with the county is the controlling document. Yes, Arthur said, his tone measured. But a testator can leave other instructions, explanations, codicils. Let's not jump to conclusions until we know what it says. He looked at me again. It's addressed to you, son. You should open it. I turned the envelope over. It was sealed with a drop of red wax, impressed with a simple V. With a trembling thumb, I broke the seal. Inside were several folded pages, the paper brittle with age, and something else, something thicker. I unfolded the pages first. It was a letter, handwritten in the same neat, strong script as the ledger. It began, "My dearest Leo." My dearest Leo. The words hit me like a physical blow. This wasn't the voice of the cold, hard man from my father's stories. This was someone else entirely. I began to read aloud, my voice shaky at first, then growing steadier as I channeled the words on the page. My dearest Leo, if you are reading this, it means I am gone, and you have come home. I hope you have. I have prayed for it every day. I know you must have 1,000 questions, and you must hate me for the silence. I don't blame you. The story you were told, the one your father believed, was that I was a cold man who chose this land over his family. It is not the truth. But it is the story I had to let the world believe for your protection. I paused, taking a breath. The room was so quiet I could hear my own heartbeat. Sarah scoffed. Protection? From what? This is garbage. Keep reading, Arthur said, his voice a low command. I continued. Your father, my son Daniel, was a good man with a good heart. But he had a weakness. He fell in with the wrong people in the city, men who dealt in easy money and hard consequences. He took out loans he couldn't repay from men who don't file papers in a courthouse. They were dangerous. When he and your mother passed, that debt did not die with them. It fell to you as his next of kin. They would have come for you, son. They would have owned you before you ever had a chance to become a man. A cold dread washed over me. I had always believed my dad was a simple mechanic, that their death was a tragic, random accident. The idea that there was a darker, more complex story underneath it all was staggering. I couldn't let that happen. So I made a deal. I contacted these men. I took on your father's debt myself. It was a staggering amount, more than I had. They wanted the ranch. It was the only thing I had of real value. But I could not give it to them. This land is not just dirt, Leo. It is our family's history. It is your great-grandfather's sweat and my father's blood. It is your legacy. So I made them another offer. I agreed to pay them off, with interest, over time. To do it, I had to mortgage this place to the hilt. I had to sell off cattle, equipment, timber rights. I had to let the place fall into a state of managed decline, to look poor, to look like there was nothing left for them to take. And I had to cut ties with you. I looked up from the page, my eyes stinging. Mark and Sarah were pale, their smug certainty replaced by a dawning, horrified understanding. It was the hardest thing I have ever done. To know you were out there, alone in the world, and I couldn't reach out. I couldn't bring you here, because their eyes were always on me, on this ranch. If they knew I had an heir, they would have used you as leverage against me. The silence was your shield, Leo. My distance was your armor. It cost me my son's memory and my grandson's love, but it kept you safe. I pray someday you can forgive me for it. I had to stop reading. A sob escaped my throat, a raw, painful sound. All the years of feeling abandoned, of feeling worthless, of believing I was the unwanted remnant of a broken family. It was all a lie. A terrible, necessary lie. I hadn't been abandoned. I had been protected. Arthur gently pushed a glass of water toward me. After a moment, I gathered myself and picked up the letter again. There was one more page. The debt is almost paid. The final payment is due a month from now. I have saved most of it, but I knew my time was running out. That is where the offer from the developers comes in. I knew they were circling. I set it up through Arthur. The sale of this ranch is not for profit, Leo. It is the final piece of the plan. The money from the sale is not to be divided. It is to be used to pay the last of the debt and clear the title to this land forever. That is my final instruction. And that brings me to the choice. I looked at the other item that had been in the envelope. It was a small, leather-bound book. A bank book. I opened it. Inside, the account name read, The Black Creek Restoration Trust. The balance was over $200,000. My grandfather's life savings. The money in the trust is what I was able to save. It's not much, not compared to the value of the land, but it is a seed. And you have a choice. Choice 1. You allow your cousins to sell the ranch. The debt is paid, The slate is wiped clean. The remaining money, if any, is yours. You can walk away, free and clear, with a fortune in your pocket. I will not blame you if you do. You are owed a life of ease. But there is a second choice. You can refuse to sell. You can use the money in this trust to pay off the final part of the debt yourself. It will take every penny. You will be left with nothing but the land itself, mortgaged, neglected, and in need of more work than one man can handle. You will be trading a fortune for a lifetime of hardship. Why would I offer you such a choice? Because this land is your home, if you want it to be. It is a place to put down roots. It is a chance to rebuild what our family lost. It is not an inheritance of money, Leo. It is an inheritance of purpose. The choice is yours. Whatever you decide, know that your grandfather loved you, always. I finished reading, and the pages fell from my hand onto the table. The room was deathly still. My entire world had been dismantled and reassembled in the last 10 minutes. The man I'd resented for 12 years had sacrificed everything for me. My father wasn't just a mechanic who died in an accident. He was a man who'd made terrible mistakes. Mistakes his father had spent the rest of his life quietly fixing. And I wasn't an orphan aging out of the system with nothing. I was the heir to a legacy of sacrifice, standing at the most important crossroads of my life. My cousins were staring at me, their faces a mask of disbelief and fury. "This is insane," Sarah finally hissed, her voice trembling with rage. "He can't do that. He can't just give away our inheritance to pay off some secret imaginary debt. The will says we get a third. The will divides the asset as it stands at the time of death," Arthur said, his voice firm and clear. And at the time of death, the asset was heavily encumbered by debt, secured against the property itself. This letter, along with the mortgage documents I have in my files, serves as your grandfather's final directive on how to settle that debt. The sale is not for profit, it's to clear the ledger. "I don't believe it," Mark shouted, slamming his hand on the table. "He's lying. The old man was senile. This is a forgery." "My grandfather wasn't senile," I said, my voice quiet but hard as steel. The grief was still there, a raw ache in my chest, but something else was rising alongside it. Anger, a protective, righteous anger. He was smarter than any of us. He played the long game to save his family. I looked at my cousins, and for the first time I didn't see intimidating figures. I saw two greedy people who had looked at this place, this history, and had only seen dollar signs. They hadn't seen the love or the sacrifice. They had seen a windfall. They had never known their grandfather at all. "So what now?" Sarah demanded, turning on Arthur. "You can't honestly be telling us that this soap opera story in a letter overrides a legal will?" "It doesn't override it," Arthur explained patiently. "It clarifies the estate's liabilities. Before any assets can be distributed to beneficiaries, all debts must be paid. Thomas simply structured his largest debt in a very particular way. The proceeds from any sale are legally obligated to go to the creditors first, and his letter appoints Leo with the authority to make the decision on how to settle it, either through the sale or through other means." All the air went out of them. The legal jargon, delivered in Arthur's calm, unshakable tone, was like a bucket of ice water. Their dreams of $1 million payday were evaporating in front of their eyes. Mark slumped back into his chair, defeated. Sarah just stood there, her mouth opening and closing silently, like a fish out of water. The choice was mine, and it was a brutal one. I could take the easy path, let them sell. The developer's money would flood in, wash away the debt, and leave me with a fortune. More money than I could ever have dreamed of. I could buy a new life, 1,000 miles away from group homes and dusty ranches. I could be comfortable, secure. No one would blame me. My grandfather himself had said so. Or I could choose the land. I could take the trust fund, every penny my grandfather had scraped together, and use it to pay off the last of the debt. I would be left with this huge, broken-down ranch, no money, no cattle, no equipment, and no idea what I was doing. I would be trading a life of ease for a life of back-breaking work, uncertainty, and struggle. It was an insane choice. It was financial suicide. It was the hardest road imaginable. I stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the fields bathed in the golden light of the setting sun. The mountains stood dark against the vibrant sky. I thought about my grandfather, alone here all those years, working himself to the bone, letting his neighbors think he was failing, letting his own family think he was cold and cruel, all to protect a grandson he barely knew. He had given me a gift far more valuable than money. He had given me a clean slate. He had given me a home. He had given me a purpose. I picked up the bank book, the Black Creek Restoration Trust. It wasn't just a name, it was a mission statement. I turned back to face the room. I looked at my cousins' bitter, resentful faces. I looked at Arthur's kind, expectant one. And I made my choice. "I'm not signing," I said. The words were quiet, but they landed in the room with the force of a thunderclap. "What?" Sarah whispered, her eyes wide with disbelief. "I'm not selling the ranch," I repeated, my voice stronger now. "I'm going to use the trust money to pay off the final debt. I'm staying." Mark shot to his feet. "You can't be serious. You're throwing away millions of dollars. For what? A pile of dirt and a broken-down house? Are you an idiot?" "Maybe," I said, "but it's my pile of dirt. My grandfather didn't spend his entire life protecting this place just so we could sell it to the highest bidder to build a golf course. He saved it for a reason. He saved it for me." "This is our inheritance too," Sarah cried, her voice cracking. "You have no right." "You have a right to 1/3 of the asset," Arthur interjected smoothly. "And the asset is the land, free and clear of its primary debt once Leo makes the payment. You'll be part owners of a working ranch, a ranch that currently has no income and requires significant investment and labor." The reality of what that meant dawned on them. They didn't want a ranch. They wanted cash. They didn't want to work the land. They wanted to escape it. "We'll see you in court," Mark snarled, his face red with fury. "We'll force a partition sale." "You can certainly try," Arthur said, unruffled. "But the courts tend to look unfavorably on forcing a sale of a primary residence, especially when one of the owners is living on the property and actively working it. It will be a long, expensive, and ugly fight. And in the end, Leo's right to stay will likely be upheld." My cousins looked at each other. They saw the fight ahead, the lawyer's fees, the years of battling their broke, stubborn cousin who had nothing to lose. They saw their easy payday turning into a legal nightmare. Without another word, Mark stormed out of the house, slamming the door behind him. Sarah gave me one last look, a look of pure, unadulterated hatred, and followed him. A moment later, I heard the engine of their SUV roar to life, tires spitting gravel as they sped away down the long drive. And then there was silence. The fight wasn't over, not by a long shot, But the first battle had been won. I sank onto the couch, the adrenaline draining out of me, leaving me exhausted and trembling. I had just turned down $1 million. I had just committed myself to a life I knew nothing about. I was 18 years old, completely alone, and the owner of a broken-down ranch. I should have been terrified, but as I sat there in the dusty, quiet house, with my grandfather's letter on the table and the weight of his legacy settling onto my shoulders, all I felt was a profound, unshakable sense of peace. I was home. The days that followed were a blur of overwhelming tasks and quiet revelations. Arthur stayed for 2 days, helping me get my bearings. He was a godsend. He walked me through the paperwork, initiated the wire transfer from the trust to pay off the final creditor, and showed me the box in his office filled with my grandfather's meticulous files. We spent hours going over the ranch's finances, the property lines, the water rights. It was a crash course in a world I didn't even know existed. "Your grandfather was preparing for this," Arthur told me, spreading a large, hand-drawn map of the ranch on the kitchen table. "These fields here," he said, pointing to a section near the creek, "he let them go fallow for the last 5 years. The soil is rested. It'll be prime for planting come spring. He sold the old tractor, but he kept the even older one, the reliable one, hidden in the back of the barn under a tarp. He knew you'd be starting with nothing." Every detail, every seemingly random act of neglect had been a calculated move, a piece of a much larger plan. He hadn't just left me the land, he had left me a fighting chance. When Arthur finally left, shaking my hand firmly and promising to handle the inevitable legal threats from my cousins, the true scale of my new reality set in. The silence of the house was immense. For the first time since I was 6, I was truly alone. Not in a crowded group home, but in a vast, empty space. The responsibility was crushing. The house needed a new roof. The barn was structurally sound, but needed countless repairs. Fences were down all over the property. The fields were choked with weeds. I started small. I spent the first week just cleaning the house. I aired out the rooms, scrubbed away years of dust, and polished the old wood furniture until it gleamed. It was mindless, physical work, and it calmed the panic that sometimes threatened to overwhelm me. As I cleaned, I found more pieces of my grandfather. I found his collection of Louis L'Amour paperbacks, his whittling tools, a hidden stash of butterscotch candies in his desk drawer. I was getting to know him in reverse, through the objects he'd left behind. One afternoon, while cleaning the fireplace, I found a loose stone in the hearth. Behind it was a small metal box. Inside was a stack of photographs and a bundle of letters tied with a ribbon. The letters were from my father to my grandfather, written in the years after he'd left the ranch. They were full of youthful bravado, apologies, and requests for money. The last few were desperate. The photographs were of me. Baby pictures, school pictures from 1st and 2nd grade. Pictures I didn't even know existed. My mom must have sent them. He had kept them. He had kept every single one. I sat on the floor and cried, not with the raw grief of before, but with a quiet, aching love for the man I had so profoundly misunderstood. Word travels fast in a small town. The day after Arthur left, a battered pickup truck rumbled up my driveway. An old man with a face like a weathered map and hands like gnarled oak roots got out. "You must be Thomas's boy," he said, his voice a low rumble. He introduced himself as Gus, my grandfather's closest neighbor. "Heard you were staying on," he said, looking me up and down, his eyes sharp and assessing. "Heard you told those developer folks and your cousins to go to hell." "Something like that," I admitted. He nodded slowly, a flicker of approval in his eyes. "Thomas was a good man. Stubborn as a mule stuck in mud, but a good man. He'd be proud. He didn't stay long. He just wanted to size me up. Before he left, he said, "Got an old post-hole digger in my barn, ain't seen use in years. If you're thinking about fixing some of that fence, you know where to find me." It wasn't just an offer of a tool. It was an offer of acceptance. A few days later, I drove my grandfather's ancient, miraculously functional truck into town for supplies. At the general store, the woman behind the counter, a kindly lady named Martha, gave me a warm smile. "You're Leo, aren't you? You have your father's eyes." She packed my groceries and slid a fresh-baked apple pie into one of the bags. "On the house," she said. "Welcome home." These small gestures were lifelines. They made me feel less like an outsider and more like a part of a community that had respected my grandfather and was willing to give his grandson a chance. The work was relentless. From sun-up to sundown, I was mending fences, clearing brush, patching the barn roof. My body ached in ways I never knew it could. My hands, once soft, were now calloused and raw. I made 1,000 mistakes. I nearly took my thumb off with a hatchet, got the old tractor stuck in the mud for an entire day, and was chased up a tree by an angry bull from Gus's property. But with every mistake, I learned. With every fence post I set, I felt myself growing stronger, more capable. I was no longer just occupying the ranch. I was becoming a part of it. The land was working its way into my bones, into my soul. One evening, exhausted and covered in grime, I was sitting on the porch, watching the stars come out in the vast, dark sky. There were more stars than I had ever seen in my life, a brilliant, shimmering canopy. A sense of profound gratitude washed over me. I thought about the other path, the $1,000,000 path. I could have been in a fancy apartment in some city, living a life of ease. But I knew, with a certainty that resonated in my very core, that I would have been poorer. I wouldn't have had this. The hard-earned ache in my muscles, the smell of the earth, the silent companionship of the mountains. I wouldn't have had this purpose. The legal threats from my cousins came, just as Arthur had predicted. Stern letters from a city law firm arrived weekly. I passed them all on to Arthur, who handled them with quiet efficiency. He told me to ignore them, to just keep working, to keep living on the land. "Possession is 9/10 of the law, son," he'd said, "and building a life is the other 10th. So that's what I did. I was building a life, one fence post, one repaired shingle, one cleared acre at a time. I was honoring the sacrifices of a man I barely knew, but had come to love deeply. I was taking the inheritance of purpose and turning it into a future. Months passed. The vibrant greens of summer faded into the golds and reds of autumn. The first snow fell, dusting the peaks of the mountains in white and signaling the end of the season's hardest outdoor labor. The legal battle with my cousins had ground to a halt. Faced with a protracted and expensive fight they were unlikely to win, they had fallen silent. Arthur suspected they were waiting, hoping I'd fail on my own, that I'd give up and come crawling back to them, ready to sell. They underestimated me. They underestimated their grandfather's legacy. I had survived my first 6 months. The ranch was still broken, but it was less broken than before. The house was warm and secure. The barn no longer leaked. A long stretch of fence along the creek was new and strong. It wasn't much, but it was a start. It was progress. I had found a rhythm, a routine. I was learning from Gus, from books I found in the local library, from the land itself. The land was a patient teacher. It taught me about weather, about soil, about the subtle signs of the changing seasons. It taught me about resilience. It taught me about myself. I learned that I was stronger than I ever thought possible. I learned that the scars from my past didn't have to define my future. I learned that home isn't just a place you are given. It's a place you choose, a place you build, a place you fight for. My inheritance hadn't been a check for $1 million. It was so much more. It was the smell of pine after a rainstorm. It was the view of the sunrise over the mountains from my father's old bedroom window. It was the satisfaction of a hard day's work. It was the quiet nod of respect from a neighbor. It was a second chance. My grandfather had given me a gift that no amount of money could ever buy. He had given me back my name, my history, and a place to belong. He had given me a home. That first winter was long and hard, but it was also beautiful. I spent the cold months working indoors, repairing the house, reading my grandfather's old books, and planning for the spring. I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was building. I was restoring not just a ranch, but a family's legacy. The story doesn't end there, of course. This was just the beginning. The ranch is still a struggle. There are days I'm so tired and overwhelmed, I think about giving up. But then I'll walk out onto the porch, look at the mountains my grandfather loved, and feel the solid ground beneath my feet, and I know I can't. This is more than just land. It's a promise. It's a testament to the fact that the most valuable things we inherit are rarely the things that can be bought or sold. Sometimes the greatest treasures are the burdens we choose to carry, the hard roads we choose to walk. It's a lesson about reframing your own story. For years, my story was about abandonment. I was the boy left behind. But I was wrong. My story was, and is, about protection, about sacrifice, and about a love so fierce it was willing to be misunderstood. It's a story about choosing purpose over profit, legacy over luxury. And I get to write the next chapter myself. That's a gift. That's everything. So I want to ask you, have you ever had to make a choice like that? A choice between the easy path and the meaningful one? Have you ever discovered a truth that changed everything you thought you knew about your own family, about your own story? Let me know in the comments below. Your stories matter. This community is a place for people who understand that life is complicated and that our greatest strengths are often forged in our hardest struggles. If this story resonated with you, if you believe in second chances and the power of finding home, please consider subscribing to the channel. We're all just trying to find our own piece of land to stand on. Thanks for listening.